Hello everyone, this is Tydrous. Today I'm going to be going through my track Pride with Pipa Moran, recently released on Emergent Cities. I'm going to be taking you through the life of the project, so from its initial idea all the way through to the final version that got released on Emergent Cities. So I'll take you through some of the intervening versions and show you kind of how the track developed over the course of its life. So with that, I'll go ahead and get into the first project. Alright, so here is Pride version 1. As you can see, there's not a whole lot to it yet. It's pretty bare bones. I've just got some drum loops here, as well as some drum samples that I've been kind of mixing in, and then a kick drum down here. And there's really not a whole lot to it quite yet. There's a whole lot to be done, but this is kind of where this project started. So I will just sort of play through this 8-bar drum loop here so you can kind of hear where it's at. And that's pretty much it. There's really not a whole lot to talk about here. I make a lot of changes in between this and the final version, as you can imagine, but yeah, I don't even know if a lot of these drums end up making it into the final version. So really, I think the kick drum may have been the only thing, and I made some modifications to that. As you can kind of tell, it doesn't sound all that great right now, but I do some additional processing and kind of tuning down of some of the parameters to make it sound a little bit cleaner overall. So yeah, with that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next project. Alright, so this is Pride version 9. As you can see, it's got quite a few more elements in it. I've got some basses here in red, a pad in green, and some lead elements in this blue color, as well as an effect and some vocal atmospheric elements. So let me play through this so you can get kind of an idea of where the track stands. Alright, so gets you kind of the basic idea of what's going on. This intro bass section here, this bass line, is pretty much the same thing for the entire 16 bars. I haven't really added any variation at this point, so it's pretty stagnant. But let me just solo out the basses so you can kind of hear those on their own. And they're some pretty cool sounds, but they're playing a pretty stagnant rhythm, and there isn't really any variation at this point. But this is kind of the initial idea that I was working with, and I change it up a little bit as we go in the course of the project. But this is kind of the starting point and where the initial bass idea kind of came from. So this kind of main bass sound here is a preset that I made some modifications to. It's got kind of a saw-like shape to it that has some distortion on it. I used some distortion outside of this using a decapitator. And then it also goes into a multiband compressor with some reverb. So the reverb is just to give it a sort of sense of space and to take advantage of some of these gaps that I made in between notes. So when this stops playing here, it lets the tail kind of ring out here in this little gap and just sort of adds some additional kind of a cool effect to this bass line and kind of sets it back a little bit in the mix so it isn't quite so in your face. So the next element I want to talk about is this ARP here. And it filters in over time using this filter here on the group, and sounds kind of like this. And I end up doing some more processing to this later on in the course of the track, but the basic idea was to have a really floaty harp sound that's pretty high in the register, but just kind of bounces around between the stereo, in the stereo field from right to left, and I do that with a ping pong delay, and then just a lot of notes. So I think the thing that took the longest for this particular sound was just getting the arpeggiation correct and making it sound so that it fit with everything else that was going on. And I think I did most of that by hand. I don't think I used like an arpeggiator or anything like that. So I was just kind of playing around with note placement in the chord and getting it to all sort of fit. So that's pretty much it there. And then I've got this sort of vocal atmospheric element that I got, I think, from Splice, and then just pitched it down a little bit and retimed it somewhat to make it fit a little better. And this is what it sounds like. And this doesn't end up making it into the final track. After I started working with Pipa, I used some of her vocals for this sort of atmospheric element, so that doesn't end up making it, but that kind of gets the idea across and kind of fills in some of the space in this section to kind of keep things interesting. So that's pretty much it for this project, so I will move on to the next one. Alright, so this is Pride version 15. So as you can see, the project is much further along in this state. I've got the start of a drop working here, I've got an initial build idea worked out, as well as the breakdown. The intro section and the bass section are largely unchanged, I think, at this point, but I've added in these like chord stabs here that I'll talk about in a second. But let me just play through some of the sections here so you can get kind of an idea of where the project stands. So a lot has changed. I've added quite a bit with this breakdown and drop section here, but the mix is still kind of atrocious and needs a lot of work, but the DNA of the final track is kind of here. You can sort of hear I've got the chords from the drop kind of started in this section. I've got this sort of stop-start pattern, kind of started working on that, as well as the breakdown here. I've got sort of the string section with the sort of swelling string sounds worked out, as well as the starts of that sort of lead sound and the build lead sound that I have in the breakdown of the final track. So let me start talking about the different elements that I added here, and I'll start with the kind of chord stabs here. So this is what they sound like right now. And not a huge fan of how these sounded, and I changed this up later on in the project, and I'll talk about that, but it's really just to sort of tease the main chords in the intro build section that I'm going to eventually introduce in the drop section. So that was kind of the reasoning for adding this here, and I'll kind of talk more about that in the more developed version later on in one of the later projects. The next thing I want to talk about is these strings, and I really like how these turned out, and they were pretty much done in their in this particular project, and this is kind of what they sound like on their own. And I really liked this kind of swell of a note and then letting it kind of ring out for a little while, and swell of another note and letting it ring out, and then the same thing for this one. And I think this is just an Omnisphere patch that I modified a little bit. I think I really just changed the envelope here for attack and decay so that it would kind of slowly swell in and then ring out for a little bit longer. And I really liked how that kind of turned out, and it really helps bring the tension down and the emotion kind of up. The next thing that I want to talk about are the lead elements that I added here. So I've got this sort of initial idea here of this lead, and it's filtering in over time. This is something that I do a lot with automation filters. And I think I keep this pattern pretty much, and it plays through the build in the final version. But it's just to kind of introduce a new idea that plays in contrast to the main sort of string section, and then kind of build tension up into the drop, and or up in the build and then to the drop. So it's a pretty straightforward element. It's just a patch in Spire here, and it's got, you know, really just some sawtooth waveforms and some reverb after the fact. It's not super complicated sound, but it gets the idea across and sounds pretty good in context. The next thing is the, I call them epic drums here, but I was really going for like that sort of orchestral drummed kind of sound, and I add some additional layers to it later on to make it sound a little bit more full and fleshed out, but this is kind of what it sounds like right now. Right now it's pretty thin, and I end up adding some lower drum elements later on to kind of fill it out a little bit more and make it much more impactful and kind of get that sort of cinematic score feel going on. So I'll kind of skip over this build section. It's nothing too special right now. It's really just some snares and kicks kind of building up with some filters. It gets a lot more interesting later on. But I'll start by talking about this drop section. So I've got the chords here that are playing and filling the sort of role of the high frequency. So this is what they're sounding like right now. So this is a combination of quite a few different presets here to kind of make that sound. It's a lot more complicated than how I like to do my layering of supersaw sounds now, but kind of gets the idea across, and I end up messing with it a little bit later on in the project. I'll talk about it a little bit more there, but the channel that I have here, this drop, this was really for the purposes of writing, to make it just easier for me to chop up this MIDI like this. So this doesn't actually have any instruments on it, it's just acting as a MIDI input that I'm sending to these 3 tracks here that are taking in that MIDI, so that I don't have to kind of copy and paste them up there. It's just a little bit easier when you're writing. So this is kind of what these sound like. It's almost a like distorted guitar sound kind of going on with this sort of sine sub going on underneath of it, just to add some weight. So the initial idea that I went with at the beginning of this drop here didn't really catch my interest as much, and I end up changing it later on into much more of this stop-start pattern that I was kind of playing with here. And I just liked how this worked out in the final version, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in the later projects, but yeah, that's kind of the initial idea that I've got here, and I change up a lot of the elements here, like the drums and the kick in later projects as well. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about with this version, so I'll go ahead and move on to the next one. Alright, so here is Pride version 30. As you can see, I've got pretty much the entire arrangement done. I've got a outro for the project now, as well as some additional variation here in the drop section. You can see it's quite a bit more intricate than it was in the last video, and there's also I think some additional elements kind of added into the intro section here as well, and really just in the intervening projects, some mixing and tweaking of sounds to get things to sound a little bit more polished. But at this point, I think the mix still leaves a lot to be desired. But let me go ahead and play through some of these sections so you can see where we're at. Alright, so you get the basic idea. This end section is really just a mini breakdown to a small build and then to an outro, which is pretty much a reverse of the intro, so I won't go into that too much. It's pretty much the same as this intro section that we already talked about, so I won't bore you with that. But some of the things that have changed, as you can hear, there were quite a few new elements introduced. The first I want to talk about is this kind of effects base that I've got going on here. So this is what it sounds like. And it's just filtering in over time as in the course of this intro, and then also in the intro bass section kind of plays a role with the bass line and kind of fills in some of the gaps that are going on throughout the intro bass section. So it's a pretty cool sound. I think it's a Spire preset that I've got the reverb mix pretty high on, yeah, and it just has a real nice kind of gritty quality to it, and then I've just got some compression and side chaining on it afterwards to kind of keep out of the way of the kick. So the next thing to note that changed was the bass rhythm is totally different. So this is what it sounds like now. So as you can hear, there's quite a lot of stuff that changed. The bass rhythm is different. It sort of evolves a little bit more, and it has a sort of almost accidental note that gets played here very quickly throughout the progression. And then there's also this cool little bass fill effect almost that's on this element here. And the way that that's achieved is I've just got a utility here that I'm panning the sound far left to right during the course of these notes that are being played, and then I have a reverb on it that's at a pretty high mix amount that really washes it out and makes it sound almost completely different from the original sound that it was. So this is what it sounds like without the reverb and panning. And then that was with. So yeah, it's just a cool effect that adds some interest and variation to this section to keep it from getting too repetitive. So the next element I'll talk about are these chords here. So like most things, I filter them in over time with a high cut filter. And like I was saying before, this is really just to tease the kind of big chords that I eventually end up using in the drop section. So the next element I want to talk about is the piano. So this was a completely new element that I added in this version, and it's sort of playing the main sort of melody of the track, and this is what it sounds like. And that's kind of the main theme of the track right there, and I play that throughout the rest of this breakdown section, and then I introduce it near the end here of the drop to kind of call back to the breakdown. And I really just like how this melody fits around the strings and the other elements that are kind of playing in this section. And I just like how that sounds. It's a contact instrument, the Gentleman, and then I've got some compression on it to just bring up the volume a little bit, this crazy EQ curve with some saturation and reverb, and then a little bit more compression to kind of catch some of the tail of the reverb and kind of bring it up a little bit. So the last thing that I'll talk about here is the drop section. So it's much different than the previous version. I've got the chords kind of chopped up throughout this whole bit. I've got pretty much no drums in this first 8 bars of the drop, and then I bring them all pretty much in here on the second 8 bars here to just sort of keep the drop moving and keep it interesting. And this is kind of what it sounds like now. So not quite the way that I would like it to sound just yet, but it's getting there. The mix is still a little bit rough, but one of the cool things I want to talk about here is this rack I've got on the end of this chord stack. So let me solo this out and change this here so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But I've got a reverb effect on this channel here that will basically swell in the reverb as time goes by, and I'm using this channel rack, I think is what it's called, or channel group, and essentially allows you to have a dry wet processing chain here, so you can kind of process 2 versions of the same signal, and one is completely unaffected, the dry signal, and then the other channel is the wet signal that you have the reverb or whatever effect on it that you want. So right here I've just got a pretty long reverb tail here, and then a mix amount at 100%, and then a compressor after it. So the way that this compressor is set up is it's side chaining to lead SC in, which is really just a MIDI instrument that's playing the exact same rhythm here. And what it's doing is basically squashing down the reverb when the supersaw is playing, and then bringing the reverb back up slowly in this gap here. And I'll kind of you can kind of see it a lot more easily in this compressor window, and I'll play it here right now. So that's kind of the idea, and it just adds a nice sort of swelling effect into the next note and fills in this gap nicely and really emphasizes this stop-start sort of pattern I was going for here. So that's pretty much all I'll talk about in this project, so I'll go ahead and move on to the next one. Alright, so here is Pride version 50, and this is the last version of the project that I worked on before I started collaborating with Pipa on the vocals. So it's kind of at its final form in terms of where all the elements are sitting and the arrangement and where everything is in the track. And I think really all that changes in between here and the final version is just mixing and getting everything to sit kind of nicely together. So I'll go ahead and play through some of these different sections so you can hear where the track's at. Alright, so that gets you the basic idea of what's going on here and where the track sort of stands. Really, most of the stuff is pretty much the same as in the last project, just a lot of mixing tweaks to get things to sound a little bit more polished and full. So the bass section here at the beginning is sounding a lot better, and I'll just play with the kick here in context so you can get a little idea of where that's sitting. So, sounded much more powerful and gritty, and I really like how that was kind of turning out there. The next thing, and I don't think I talked about this in the last video, was this sort of swelling effect that I've got right before the drop here, and this is kind of what it sounds like. And the way that I achieved this is, and you can kind of see it in the waveform here, is it's really just this first note of the supersaws kind of extended with a reverb, and then I reversed it and put a LFO tool on it to give it that kind of pumping effect, and it really just adds a nice sort of fill effect to the beginning of this drop to really bring it to a point and get you to really have this drop hit hard. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about there, and then the next thing I wanted to talk about was this sort of accent kick that I've got going on here. So this second channel called Accent is just basically a copy-paste of the same kick as the main kick, and it's really just playing at a lower velocity, so the volume is a little bit quieter, and it's just playing on these sort of offbeat kind of sections, and adds in a cool sort of element to the gaps that I've put in the supersaws. So this is what they sound like with just the kick and the accent kick. And when you combine those with the chords, and they really just sort of play right before the chords are going to kick back in, and just adds a nice cool little flourish that I really liked in this particular part of the track. So the next bit I want to talk about are the sort of effects. So I added a whole bunch of risers, most notably in this build section here. And I mean, they're nothing too special, but when you combine all of them together, it really helps just kind of build the tension. So I've got kind of a white noise sweep here, as well as a kind of pitched riser with this sort of kind of plucky pitched riser effect here, and then another riser here, and there's an impact partway through to really bring the energy up as you're going towards the end of the build here. So really reusing a lot of those riser effects throughout the whole project, as you can kind of see here. Then right here at the end of the drop, I'll just play this here again so you can kind of hear what I'm talking about, but I've got this sort of transitionary effect that I'm going to talk about for a sec. This is what it sounds like. So the way that this works, and the reason I kind of did it, was just to have a kind of different transitionary effect, and I really liked how this one worked out. So I basically cut out everything on this last quarter of the bar here, and then I have just the chords and a few of the other elements playing here. So I've got a mute on the melodic elements, as well as a mute on the pads and on the basses. But the one thing that I want to talk about is this automation right here. So let me solo out the chords so you can hear what I'm talking about. And all that's really happening here is I've got a high cut filter that I'm sweeping through the frequency spectrum here with a really high resonance. So I've got the resonance automated up pretty much all the way at 99%, and then I sweep through from 20 kilohertz to 26 hertz down here really quickly with that high resonance. Gives it that almost like lasery effect. And I really like how that just sounds, and when you're listening to the radio edit, that's pretty much where the drop ends, and I can kind of play that for you over here, because in this version of the project I also have the radio edit. So I've got that just over here right next to the extended mix. Just makes making changes to any of the individual elements a lot easier. So in the radio edit, it pretty much stops right at that point and just kind of brings it to a nice quick ending that I really kind of liked. So this is what it sounds like with just nothing after it. And yeah, so that's pretty much it for this project. So I'll go ahead and move on to the final version next, and that's the one where I'll start talking about the vocals that I worked on with Pipa. Alright, so here is Pride 76, and this is the final version of the track that has Pipa's vocals all worked in. It's got the radio edit totally finalized, and the only thing that's different between this and the final release is the master. Emergent has their own mastering engineer that does all the masters for their tracks. So yeah, what I have here is just a basic master that I put together just to get the track nice and loud and kind of gelling together. So I will like always, play through the different sections of the track and just give you an idea of where it stands.
Waiting for
Alright, so that's the basic idea. As you can hear, I've got Pipa's vocals worked in. I have a sort of atmospheric ad-lib vocal here at the beginning that's filtering in, as well as the main vocal throughout the entire track. So let me just go into some of the automation that I have on her vocals and give you kind of an idea of what I did to process them and just give them that sort of interesting additional flourish, like with all these delays and reverbs and such. So let me just start by talking about the ad-lib vocal here. So let me play it further along so you can hear it a little better. But this is what it sounds like on its own. And that's just a little snippet of one of her vocals that she sent me, and I've just got some processing on it here. I've got this Nectar plugin that I believe is just doing some pitch correction here, pretty standard settings. I didn't really change too much there, but just to kind of keep it more in the exact pitch that I was looking for. And then I've got a compressor after it with a high boost to give it more high end, and then I just have a utility here lowering the gain a little bit, then a reverb followed by another compressor to kind of catch some of the tail, and then this sidechain I'm automating off and on. So the tail of the reverb gets that sort of pumping effect, whereas the initial sound is unaffected by the sidechain, so it has this sort of pumping effect after the vocal plays. So let me just demonstrate that here so you can hear it. And yeah, that's just to add some interest to it, and also gets it out of the way of some of the other elements that are playing at that same time. So that's pretty much it there. And then this main vocal here, I've got several delays on this channel here. So I've got quite a bit of processing. There were some kind of harsh frequencies up in the high end that I wanted to kind of cut out, and then I've got some similar stuff. I've got a Nectar here that's doing a little bit pitch correction again, as well as some compressors and utilities. I'll just open these up here. This one's lowering the gain just a little bit. This one is taking a little dip out of the high end again. Roth Air is adding some of that high end back in, and then I've got a reverb there. So the next sort of elements that I have on this bus are all of the kind of spatial effects that I'm turning off and on. So each of these different groups has some things in them. So this is one of the delays that I've got turning on here. So this is what it sounds like. A new day. And I'm just turning it on New Day right here so that it rings out for this little gap while the basses come back in, and it's adding a sort of a additional element here that is complementing the basses as they're playing, but not really getting in their way because it's much further back in the mix. Then I have another delay that I turn on over here for a different phrase. And this is a different timing, so it's a little off of what you would normally expect. It's not quarter notes and it's not eighth notes, so it sort of has this not really swing feel to it, but just kind of offbeat feel to it that I really liked that how that sounded in this particular context. So yeah, that's automated off and on for certain words in the vocal performance, just to add some additional character to it there. So the last one is this reverb here at the end. I'm going to just play this phrase for you. To keep. And this is really just a way of transitioning into the build section so that it really brings up the energy into the build. So let me just play this part for you one more time with everything together. And as you can hear, it really brings up the energy from this almost like pre-build section into the main build, and just helps to raise the energy towards the drop. So that's pretty much it. Most of this is just kind of rinse and repeat from the intro to the outro, so I won't really cover that too much, but yeah, I will go ahead and leave you with the radio edit. So thank you for checking this out with me, and if you have any questions about any of the elements that you might want me to go in depth more on, of how I made them, or the layering for the chords, or how I process the piano, or anything like that in more detail. I know I went through a lot of this stuff pretty quick, so yeah, if you want to just leave a comment below with what you want to see, I will try my best to create a standalone video for just that element, so you can kind of see how I made it. So yeah, with that, I will go and play the radio edit, and thanks you guys for watching. Waiting for the new day. One where we can escape. Somehow we'll find a way to get around the mistake. Can we rewrite? Can we rewrite?